Created with free version for non-commercial use.
In this lesson, we will learn about the CSS property named transition. This property allows us to animate or transition smoothly between two different values. Now, this is a bit difficult to describe in words, so let's see it in action. In front of you is an example page, and I want you to focus on these links in the header. Notice that when I hover over a particular link, it lights up with a white background and the color of the text changes to blue. Now, the CSS code used to create that hover effect is nothing new. We've reviewed the hover pseudo selector in an earlier lesson. So we're simply styling the links, and then we're using this pseudo selector to say once one of the links is hovered over, apply these unique styles. So we're swapping out the background color and the color of the text. However, the transition between the non-hover state and the hover state is very abrupt. So the links immediately, within 1 millisecond, go from one style to the other. Now, what if we wanted to alter this behavior so that the transition between the two style states took a full 2 seconds to complete? So that way the human eye could see all of the intermediate states and color gradations between white and dark blue. Well, this is where the transition property comes into play. So in our style sheet, within the rule for the links, I will add a new property named transition property. This is where we can specify which properties the web browser should keep an eye on and watch for changes. So let's begin with the color of the text. Color. Next, I will add an additional property named transition duration. This is where we can specify how long the transition should take. So I will say 2 seconds, 2s. So if I save and refresh, we can see that the background changes immediately, but the color of the text takes 2 seconds to transition from white to dark blue. And if we also wanted the background color to take 2 seconds to transition, in our transition property, after color, we can include a comma and then spell out background color. So if we save and refresh, you can see now both properties use the full 2 seconds to transition very smoothly between the two states. And here's a quick tip that can save you a bit of typing. If you want all of the properties to transition, you don't need to spell them out. You can simply type all. The all keyword is very useful. I find myself using it most of the time, but I did want you to be aware that you do have the flexibility to specify specific properties if need be. So we've learned how to transition smoothly between two values, but let's be honest, fading between two different colors is not that exciting. So let's try something a bit more adventurous. Now, if I scroll down the example page a bit, you'll see this image with a caption positioned over it that has a transparent black background. We learned how to create this effect in an earlier lesson in the course. But that was a few lessons ago. We now have a few more tricks up our sleeve. Let's imagine that we want the caption area, the black box, to be hidden by default. And we don't want it to display until we hover over the image. And we don't want it to abruptly appear. We want to gradually fade or transition or animate the caption into view. Now, in our HTML, the caption area for the image has a class of banner description. So I will search for that in my style sheet. Here is the corresponding rule. And the first thing that I'm going to do is hide the content by default. Now, there are many ways to achieve that. I'm going to use the method where I push the content down, and then on hover, I'll pull the content back into view. So let's use the transform property and use the translate y function. So we want to push the content down so it's out of view. Now, instead of trying to count how many pixels down we want to push it, if we use a value of 100%, it will use the height of the content itself and move down that much. So for example, if I save and refresh, we see that the caption box has been pushed down the perfect amount. Now clearly the caption box is still visible, and we wanted it to be hidden initially. Now to hide this caption, we can rely on our HTML structure. So we know that this is the caption content. It has a class of banner description, and it lives within the div with a class of image banner. So this is the element's parent. Now in our style sheet, we can target that parent element and say that any child content that has been pushed out of this parent's boundaries should be hidden. So with overflow hidden in place, if we refresh, we can see the caption is now hidden. So we are now free to attempt to transition or animate the caption into view when we hover over the image. So I'm going to create a new rule. Anytime we hover over the parent image banner div, we want to apply new styles to the banner description or caption box. So initially we used transform translate Y to push the content out of view. We can simply copy and paste that into this new selector and say that instead of being pushed down, use a value of 0 or just sit where you normally would. So this line of code will make the caption content visible while we are hovering over any part of the image. However, this is a lesson about the transition property. So we don't want to abruptly transition between completely hidden to completely visible in 1 millisecond. We know that the translate Y function positions content. And if we can see all of the intermediate steps and transitions between these two values, we have the beginnings of an animation. So within the rule for our banner description element, let's include a property of transition property all transition duration 1 second. Now, if we save and refresh and hover over the image, it slides or animates into view, and it is silky smooth. Next, let's take things a step further and not only have the caption content slide into view, but fade into view from a transparency perspective. So within the original rule, we can set the opacity to 0, and then within our hover rule, we can set the opacity to 1. And because we set transition property to all, the browser will look for any and all changes on hover. So if we save and refresh, we see that the opacity of the caption content is also being transitioned. So now we have a very neat sliding and fading effect taking place. So the caption box is complete. Let's talk for a moment about the image itself. Let's imagine we wanted the image itself to pan or zoom in when it is being hovered over. We can achieve this effect very easily. So within our style sheet, here is the rule that targets the image element. Let's simply create a hover rule. So when we hover over the image banner element, we want to target the image. Now to create a zooming or panning effect, we can say transform scale 1.5. And let's be sure to add the transition property to the image element. Transition property all transition duration 1 second. Now I have to let you in on a bit of a secret. We don't need to type this out as two properties. The shorthand is simply transition all 1 second. So that saves us a bit of code. So with that in place, if we refresh, we can see that when we hover over the image, it then uses a scale using the transform property of 1.5. And because we set the parent element to overflow hidden, the image doesn't spill out of the container when it zooms. And obviously we have the transition property to thank for the animation effect. So we get to see all of the intermediate steps between a scale of 1 and 1.5 spread out over 1 second. Now if we wanted a very gradual or slow effect, we could increase the transition to 3 seconds. So anything is possible, and hopefully this encourages you to experiment with transition effects on your own. Now let's try one last final experiment very quickly before the lesson ends. At the bottom of the sample page, we can see a circle element. Let's work together to create an effect so that when we hover over the circle, it rotates 360 degrees. This element has a class of box B, so I will search for that in the style sheet. Here it is. Let's create a hover-based rule for the element, box B, hover, So when the element is hovered, we want to use the transform property and rotate the content 360 degrees. So if we save and refresh, we see nothing happens because without an animation or transition, we don't see the 360 degree change. It's a full rotation. So if we set the transition to all 1 second, we can actually watch the circle rotate. Now this circle example is an excellent opportunity to introduce you to one more property, transition timing function. This controls the acceleration and deceleration of the transition. So if I set this to linear, you'll notice that the animation plays at a steady speed. But if I provide a different value, ease in, we can see that the animation begins slowly and then finishes fast. Or if I provide a value of ease out, it starts fast and ends slowly. You can also try ease in out, and it will start slowly, perform fast, and then end slowly. Now, if we don't include this line at all, most web browsers by default will use a function named ease, which is similar to ease in out, except that it starts slightly faster than it ends. Now, we technically do not need to include an entirely separate property. We can simply add a keyword of the timing function at the end of our transition line. So this is the standard shorthand syntax for the transition property. You specify which properties you want to transition, how long the transition should take, and the method you would like to use for the acceleration and deceleration of the transition. And that will bring this lesson to a close. To review, we learned that the transition property can be used to smoothly and seamlessly see all of the intermediate steps between two different values. Now in this lesson, we used the hover pseudo-selector to create situations where elements were receiving different values. The transition property can be used for much more than hover effects. But for the time being, we are working under the assumption that you do not know JavaScript at this point. So the hover scenario is your best bet to experiment and learn about the transition property. I encourage you to have a bit of fun and create your own unique transition effects, because in our next lesson, we're going to take things a step further by comparing and contrasting CSS transitions with actual CSS animations. It should be a lot of fun. I will see you in the next lesson. Just a quick heads up that if you have a spare moment or two, I would really appreciate it if you could go and rate and review this course. I hope you're enjoying the course and finding it helpful, but even if you are not, above all else, an honest review is the best review. And I would love for prospective students to be able to see honest impressions of the course.
Created with free version for non-commercial use.